All right. Now that we've gone through the process of gathering the data, we've analyzed it, we've prepared it, we can finally start training a model. So when we get to this part of our MLOps pipeline, what that means is we experiment with different hyperparameters, different algorithms, and maybe even different data sets. At the preparation phase, you might decide that you want to have multiple data sets with different features just to try out different ideas that you have and see what kind of results you get when you train a model. So, as you run these experiments, keep in mind that each experiment consists of three things: the code, the data, and the model that results. So typically when you do a machine learning experiment, you'll have some kind of code, let's say a Python script, where you'll have your algorithm for the machine learning model that you want to try. So this might be a random forest classifier, or it might be some kind of SVM, but the code is that particular script you run when you decide which algorithm you want to experiment with. And then, of course, you have your different data sets, and then, regardless of the other two, there will always be some kind of model that results. So even if you make a small change to your code or you decide to go with a different data set, all of these experiments will have these three components. And as you can guess, as you run experiments, keeping track of them can get a little bit messy, because in the course of an hour, you might run anywhere from 3 to 100 experiments. Maybe more, maybe less, depending on how resource intensive your experiments are. Some experiments might even take days to run, but again, it depends on what type of resources you have available, the data that you're training with, the algorithms that you're using for training, and as you make tiny changes to, let's say, your hyperparameters, this gets really hard to track because each of your experiments has code, data, and a model associated with it. But good for us, kind of one of the big things with MLOps is helping us keep track of all the experiments we run as we train our model and see which one will be the best for our particular project. So there's a lot of tools out there to help us keep track of that code, data, and the resulting models. There are some open source options and again some enterprise options. So if you want to track your changes in data and your experiments, DVC is a really good tool. It's an open source tool. And if you want something that gives you a little bit more structure, MLflow is a really commonly used MLOps tool when it comes to experiment tracking. And then you have Neptune AI, which is another tool that's really good for experiment tracking. Or you could go with a completely custom Git workflow. So if you have some maybe more secure data that you need to train models with, or you just need really fine granular control of how your experiments are tracked, maybe a custom Git workflow would be a good option there. But the goal of all of this experimentation and the point of this train a model step in general is to get the best performing model. So what we do is use the training data set that was created in our data preparation step. So we're taking let's say, a third of our total data, and we're using it to train the model. And you might get to this point and realize that you want to do a little bit more feature engineering. Maybe now that you've really gotten into the experiments and you see how the model responds to different changes in your data, you might go back and see if there's maybe some new correlation, or there's some different scale that you should work with, or there's just something else you can do to get the data in the format that works best for the model you're trying to build. So when you have this feature engineering kind of baked into your model training stage, MLOps becomes even more important, because remember, we're trying to keep track of code, data, and the model. So if you change your data at all for any experiment, you need to know what data set you actually train that particular model with, or else you won't be able to reproduce it. So you might find this incredible model. It's super fast, it has like a 98% accuracy, and you don't know which data set you trained it on. So you don't want to get in this situation, and that's why we take the time to implement the tools that track our code, data, and model for every experiment. And that's why we want to make sure our data sets are also versioned, because this can get a little bit tricky when it comes to data storage. So that's something that you'll have to consider as you weigh out the pros and cons of the different experiment tracking tools, because some of them do offer ways to basically track the metadata of your data to determine which files were changed. Also, make sure you take note of your training environment configs, because sometimes the environment that you're training in is completely different from your production environment, and you'll have to take that into account for different resources you have available. So maybe in your training environment you only have CPUs, but in production you have GPUs. This will make a huge difference on your model performance. And the best part, again, with MLOps, a lot of your model training can be automated. And as we get into more detail in this course, you'll see how we use these tools to help us automate our model training process.